The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret Calloway had always thought that life-changing news would come with some kind of warning. A shift in the air, a heaviness in the chest before the moment arrived. But there was nothing, just the mail slot clicking, an envelope sliding onto the hardwood floor, and the ordinary Tuesday morning light falling across her kitchen like it always had. She picked it up without hurrying. She made her coffee first. She even fed the cat. Then she sat down at the table where she had eaten 31 years of breakfasts, where she had helped her daughter Emma with algebra homework, where she had laughed with her late husband Daniel over bad jokes and cold eggs, and she opened the envelope. Final notice of foreclosure. Vacate within 30 days. Margaret set the letter down. She took one sip of coffee. Then she folded her hands in her lap, closed her eyes, and sat in the silence of a house that was no longer hers. She was 62 years old. She had worked as a school librarian for 27 years. After Daniel died 4 years ago, the medical debt had come like a second funeral. Slower, quieter, but just as total. She had fought it the way she fought everything, steadily, without drama, making calls and writing letters and believing that if she just kept her head down and kept working, the ground would hold beneath her. It didn't hold. Her daughter Emma, who lived in Phoenix with 2 young kids and a mortgage of her own, had offered the pull-out couch. Margaret had thanked her and said no. She was not going to Phoenix. She was not going to become someone's burden. She was 62 years old and she had 2 hands and a working mind, and she was not done yet. She started looking online that same evening. Not for apartments she couldn't afford, and not for senior housing complexes that smelled like recycled air and defeat. She searched with different words: abandoned, rural, cheap, land, fixer, distressed property. She searched the way a person searches, when they are not looking for comfort but for possibility. On the 4th night, she found it. Harlan County, Kentucky. 11 acres of land with what the listing called a structure. The photograph showed a collapsed barn, one wall caved in, the roof partially gone, weeds growing straight up through the floorboards. The price had been reduced 3 times. The final listing, $9 plus back taxes of $412. She stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she called the county land office at 8 the next morning, and by the end of that week, Margaret Calloway had spent her last $421 on 11 acres of broken land and a barn that the wind had halfway finished demolishing. Her daughter cried on the phone. Her neighbor Carol told her it was a breakdown. Her former colleague Ruth said gently that maybe grief did strange things to people, and would she consider talking to someone? Margaret thanked them all and drove south. The barn sat at the end of a dirt road so overgrown that her old Subaru scraped brush the entire last quarter mile. When she stepped out and stood in front of it, the enormity of what she had done landed on her all at once. The structure was worse than the photograph. One entire wall had collapsed outward, rotted timber lying in tall grass. The roof over the north section was gone completely, open to the grey October sky. There was no plumbing, no electricity. The well on the property hadn't been tested in decades. The nearest town, a place called Cutter's Creek, was 9 miles away. Margaret stood in the cold and looked at all of it. She did not cry. She had cried enough. Instead, she opened the back of her Subaru, pulled out the tent she had bought at a Goodwill outside Louisville, and started figuring out which part of the barn floor was solid enough to sleep on. That first month was the hardest thing she had ever done, and she had buried a husband. She learned quickly, and she learned by failing. The well water tested safe, but the hand pump needed a new seal, which meant a 40-minute drive to the hardware store in Cutter's Creek and a YouTube tutorial, watched on her phone with 2 bars of signal. She patched the pump. She learned to build a fire in the stone, pit outside and cook over it without burning everything. She wore every layer she owned when the November nights dropped into the 30s. She woke up stiff and cold and tired, and she worked anyway. The people of Cutter's Creek watched her with cautious curiosity. The man who ran the hardware store, a quiet, broad-shouldered fellow named Walt, started setting aside useful scraps for her without being asked lengths of lumber, spare hinges, half-used cans of wood sealant. He never made a show of it. They just appeared at the edge of the counter when she came in. An elderly woman named Iris, who had farmed the land 2 properties over for 50 years, knocked on her car window one morning while Margaret was parked outside the post office. "You the woman fixing up the Callaway barn?" Iris asked. "Bought it anyway," Margaret said. "Fixing is generous." Iris looked at her for a moment with sharp brown eyes. "Come by Saturday. I'll show you what that soil is good for." Margaret came by Saturday. What Iris showed her changed everything. The 11 acres, Iris explained, sat on some of the deepest topsoil in that part of the county. Decades of neglect had actually helped it. No chemicals, no overworking, just rest. The soil was rich and dark and forgiving. Iris pressed a handful of it into Margaret's palm and told her what it could grow. Tomatoes, squash, beans, root vegetables, fruit trees along the south-facing slope. A kitchen garden for now. Something larger if she had the will for it. Margaret looked down at the dark earth in her hand. She had spent 3 decades helping children find stories in books. Now, at 62, standing in a Kentucky field in borrowed work gloves, she thought that maybe she had been waiting all her life to step inside one. She built that winter, slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly. She patched walls with reclaimed wood and tutorial videos and sheer refusal to quit. Walt's quiet contributions kept appearing. 2 of Iris's grown sons came over one brutal Saturday in January and helped her lift, and set the new roof beams without being asked and without accepting payment. And when she tried to thank them, they just shrugged in the way that people shrug, when something is simply the right thing to do. By March, one section of the barn was weather-tight and livable. Not beautiful, not finished, but solid. She planted in April. And here is where you must stay with her, because what happened in that soil is the part that mattered most. Not the harvest, not what came later, but the act itself. Every morning that spring, Margaret Callaway walked out into those 11 acres and put her hands into the earth, and something that had been locked inside her chest since Daniel's last hospital room and the first foreclosure letter began slowly to release. If you have ever lost everything, and then found that your hands still work and the ground still responds, you will understand what that felt like. If you haven't, stay with this story to the end, because it is worth understanding. And if this channel has ever brought you a story that stayed with you, this is the moment to subscribe and keep watching. Because what Margaret built next was more than anyone expected. By July, she had more food than she could eat alone. She started leaving baskets at the end of the dirt road. Zucchini, tomatoes, green beans, cucumbers, labeled with a handwritten note. Take what you need, leave what you can. People from Cutter's Creek began stopping. A young mother with 3 kids who worked double shifts at the gas station. An older man named Frank who had lost his wife and stopped cooking for himself. A teenager named Darius who came by every Wednesday on his bicycle and always put $2 in the basket even when he took very little. Word spread the way words spread in small places, person to person, table to table. By August, a local food blogger from the next county overposted a photo of Margaret's baskets with a small piece about what she was doing. It was a simple story. Woman loses home, buys broken barn, feeds neighbors. But something about its plainness hit people exactly right. The post was shared 5,000 times, then 50,000. The calls started coming. Journalists, a documentary filmmaker from Nashville, a non-profit in Louisville focused on food sustainability in rural Kentucky, a seed company that wanted to donate materials, a young couple who had been looking for land and wanted to learn what she knew, an agricultural extension officer who drove 4 hours just to walk her fields and said quietly, standing at the edge of her south slope, that he hadn't seen soil management like this done by instinct in 20 years of work. Margaret answered the calls from her repaired barn, sitting in the wooden chair she had rebuilt from pieces she found in the collapsed wall, her phone on the table next to a cup of coffee and the cat. She had somehow kept through all of it. She said yes to some things and no to others. She let the documentary filmmaker come. She said no to the magazine that wanted to call her story an inspirational comeback. She didn't consider it a comeback. She had not gone anywhere. She had just kept moving. Emma flew in from Phoenix in September with her 2 kids and stood at the end of the dirt road and looked down toward the barn and the gardens and the fruit trees coming in along the slope, and she started crying before she even reached the door. Margaret held her daughter in the Kentucky afternoon and let her cry. "Mom," Emma said. "Mom, how did you do this?" "I didn't have anywhere else to be," Margaret said. And that was the truest answer she had. That fall, with the help of the non-profit and 3 families who came to learn and stayed to help, Margaret Calloway turned her 11 acres into a community growing operation. Not a farm in the commercial sense, not a brand or a business, but a working place where food was grown and shared and people learned how to put their hands in the earth. She called it nothing formally. The people of Cutters Creek called it Margaret's Place, and the name stuck without ceremony. The barn, rebuilt now and warm and lit with second-hand fixtures and mismatched rugs, became the gathering place on Friday evenings. Iris came every week. Walt came sometimes and stood in the back and drank coffee and said very little. Darius, the teenager from the bicycle, started helping on weekends and told Margaret one evening in November that he wanted to study agriculture, that he had never considered it before and now could not stop thinking about it. Margaret looked at him the way she used to look at children who had just found the right book. "Then study it," she said. On a cold Saturday in December, 14 months after the foreclosure letter slid through her mail slot on that ordinary Tuesday morning, Margaret Calloway sat in her rebuilt barn with a cup of coffee and her cat and listened to the sound of people arriving down the dirt road. She could hear car doors, voices, the particular warmth of people gathering in winter. In a few minutes, the barn would be full, and there would be food on every surface, and someone would laugh too loud, and Iris would tell a story she had told before, and nobody would mind. Margaret looked around at the walls she had rebuilt, and the floor she had sealed, and the windows she had fitted one cold afternoon, with hands that didn't quit even when they were numb. She had paid $9 for this, not for the barn, not for the land, for the chance to find out what she was still capable of when everything false had been stripped away and only the true things remained. Her hands, the soil, the quiet conviction that beginning again was not the same as losing. Outside, the first car pulled to a stop at the end of the road. She set down her coffee, stood up and opened the door.